Good day, everyone, and welcome back to the 26th episode of the IDRiM podcast. Today, we're going to talk about all things ethics with Dr. Lauren Traczykowski, and we are going to look in particular about ethics in disasters. So I'll let Lauren introduce who she is and where she comes from, first of all.
Hi, Lauren Traczykowski. I'm a senior teaching fellow at Aston University at Birmingham in the UK. But you will hear the American accent. I'm American. My first proper job, the real one where you get a real salary. I worked for the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency in their Office of International Affairs, and so I think I fell in love with disaster work having worked there. And then when I went back to get my master's and then PhD, it kind of morphed from there. I have a PhD in global ethics, and we're going to talk about some of the content of my PhD and stuff. But the global ethics, it made sense. And the more work that I do, I realize that, ethics was the right path for me. And I think about my work as constituting these ideas of social good. So ethics in disasters is just a logical component of that. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Lauren, for coming here today to be interviewed. So we'll start with the first question. What do we mean by ethics in disasters, and how is it different from ethics in more stable contexts?
Yeah. So Peter Singer has a line that circumstances alter cases. So how we understand ethics in our day-to-day, the circumstances change in disasters. And so the way that we apply or interpret or use the ethics in disaster or crisis situations just changes because the circumstances are different. But Naomi Zak argues that our ethics in disasters versus stable contexts, or you'll probably hear me say it like peacetime, they shouldn't change. Our ethics should never change. It's just how they're applied, how the context changes the way that we work with them in those different circumstances. And so when I talk about ethics in disasters or disaster ethics or ethics in a crisis, however you want to talk about it, what I'm looking at is how those particular circumstances change the way that application of normative theory and different professional ethics actually works out. But the larger thing, and the thing that I'm trying to push within this newly emerging discipline of disaster ethics, is the idea that it's not just, here are the ethics that we do in disasters. Here are the kind of decisions we have to make. Here's how we work through decision making. What I'm trying to push, hopefully our listeners, but also, my students and the larger public, is that there are so many different professions that work within disasters. So a lot of times people say, oh, right, emergency managers or first responders or doctors. And you're like, cool, those definitely. But there are also teachers. There are also business people. There are also bin men. There are also postal workers. All of these different professions actually operate in disasters, and their decision making and the issues and problems that they have to face are slightly altered because of the disaster situation. So it's also about all these professions and understanding how each of them has to operate in a disaster. And then if you look at the discipline overall, it's saying, look, we have all of these silo or stovepipe, depending on where your listeners understand English from. We have all these silos and stovepipes of professions. We need to understand how to coordinate ethically across, not undermining any of the profession's ethics, but at the same time recognizing that each of our professions can't operate in a bubble, that we also have to recognize the circumstances have changed and we're operating across different professions at the same time. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by disaster ethics.
So based on your explanations, it's circumstantial. I mean that it depends on the context where do you operate the ethics on.
Yeah.
So is there any differences to many state differences between disaster and any other state differences, perhaps like, for example, or the war or something like that?
Okay, so I teach a module called Ethics in a Crisis, and I give the difference between a disaster and a crisis. There are many different ways of understanding this. I'm going to give you mine. So for a disaster, I say that there's a trigger event And what that does is there's this trigger event, and then there's some sort of societal vulnerability, societal infrastructure issues, plus the humans affected, plus the vulnerability, and then you get this disaster, right? So we can say that there's the one trigger event, and then it's the complications that follow. For crisis, we can say, well, something like climate crisis, there's not one thing that's happened that's caused us to have a climate crisis. There's a lot of little things that just keep coming up. So when we look at something like war or famine, right? Those are more multi-trigger point events. And that's why it's not necessarily bad to link them with disasters, but it's also not necessarily realistic for us to go, oh, well, something happened and now we have a war. So I link that under ethics in a crisis and say, okay, but it's not as simple as just going, this happened. We have to think about the multiple trigger events that have caused this so that we can unpack the ethical decisions of that happened that resulted in all those triggers, but also all the different players that will be involved as a result of there being multiple triggers. So I do cover things like war as well as something like a forest fire. And I think that a lot of the decision making, because it'll be, imminent death as a result, I think though that a lot of the decision making can be talked about at the same time, but we can also make that distinction. By the way, if I talk about death, it may sound a little flippant. That is not my intention. But in the same breath, when you've been studying disasters for the past 10, 12 years, if you don't just go, okay, so those people died, you're never going to get through it. And so if the goal is actually helping people and helping more people survive, it's a matter of, I guess, academic privilege to just recognize that I'm just going to keep saying these numbers and I'm going to say death in what might sound like a flippant way, but it's not. Please understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of us who work in disasters, we become desensitized to that issue. And sometimes we have to be desensitized to it as well, because if we reflect upon every single death, we'll never progress the science.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And also, it's quite interesting when you try and define, the difference between crisis and disaster there very quickly. I feel that more recently that line is becoming more blurred a little bit, because if you just said about a forest fire, which is a disaster, and then you got the climate crisis, where does that end and that start is becoming a bit more, because the crisis is now changing the disaster, which it's a bit more complicated when that happens. And that
absolutely. They're interlinked. And that's why I teach them together, recognizing, okay, well, we can talk about them as different events, but there's going to be a lot of the same issues. And I like that you called me out on the forest fires one, because climate change is affecting the increased number of forest fires, same as it's affecting the increased impact of hurricanes and things like that. So, well, there's not just one trigger event, right? I think simplicity, and also for those responding, I think those people that are responding to a forest fire will see it as an event. They might see multiple events happening and it's like caused by climate change, but I think that the response comes under an event, and they're not going to, whilst trying to, put out a fire, they're not going, well, let's talk about the climate change. It's like, no, let's put out the fire, let's save the people, and then we go on. And I think that's the only way that I'm keeping them separate, but I agree and completely am on board with your merging the two.
Yeah, so now when we come to about, disasters, let's flip to this side for a minute. Why are disasters particularly revealing of society's ethical priorities?
Why are they what? Revealing of society's ethical priorities?
Yes.
Yeah. So I started setting up a little formula for you in one of the previous questions. And it's this idea that a disaster equals hazard plus risk. No, a disaster, let's do this again. A risk is the hazard plus vulnerability. There it is. That's the formula. So risk is hazard plus vulnerability. Now, if there's no hazard, right? So if a tornado, because a tornado is one of those like nice ones where that they just happen, right? So, or an earthquake, and not a fracking earthquake, just a regular earthquake. That's the hazard. There's this trigger event that goes up. Now, the only reason that that turns into a disaster is because of what is happening in society around it. So if there is an underwater, no, underwater's not good. Let's think. If there is a small earthquake, I'm from New Jersey. There was an earthquake the last time I was home. It was something like a 4.2 or something earthquake. That was the hazard, right? That happened. The people in New Jersey are not really vulnerable to that kind of hazard. One, we're not building on fault lines. Two, even if we're near fault lines, the fault lines are actually not going to have, 9.0 earthquakes. And so our vulnerability, because of where we've built our houses, is lower. But then there's also, we have really good infrastructure. We're quite a wealthy state. And so our ability to send out emergency responders, we're all very closely like living together. And so it's not going to be like an hour before the next ambulance gets to us if that's needed. So those are all the things that are our vulnerabilities. Now, when we talk about society's ethical priorities, are we actually serving the needs of the local people? Is there a good emergency management network? So first responders and things like that. Can people actually access healthcare? Are there social, racial, gender inequalities that will actually mean that people get less assistance in the aftermath of a hazard, right? So what a disaster ends up doing is it works in combination, or a hazard works in combination with these elements that are vulnerability, and that increases the impact of the disaster. But if our vulnerabilities are lower, no matter the hazard, the impact of the disaster will be lower. If we think about it as a formula, right? So like disaster or risk equals hazard plus vulnerability. If your vulnerability is lower, so how your society actually supports the humans that live there is really, really good and everybody's supported, then that piece of the puzzle doesn't really get exacerbated by the impact of the hazard.
So, well, taking on your explanations that you revealed about the more vulnerabilities, right? So it's because I think it's the main driving factors how it becomes disasters, because the natural hazard is just natural phenomena that just appear out of nowhere sometimes. So how the ethical frameworks account for these vulnerabilities in disasters, especially in the preparedness or the response and relief process.
So how does the ethical framework account for vulnerabilities? That's your question, right? Okay. So interestingly, as of right now, I would say that there isn't an ethical framework for disasters. And so I don't have an answer for your question, but, right? So that's my easy answer if I wanted to like a get out of jail free card. So there's not an ethical framework for disasters because each society is going to attack things differently. Each disaster is going to be slightly different. The different professions that are going to come in are going to be different and stuff like that. But how do we ethically account for, or how should we think about vulnerability from an ethical perspective? It all comes down to preparedness, right? So what are we willing to, or what should we be preparing for? We cannot just say, oh, okay, well, I've stockpiled X number of gallons of water because each human individual requires Y number of gallons of water day to day. Well, that's actually not sufficient, because what about those people that need extra water to, I don't know, support the medicine that they're going to be having to inject in themselves? What if certain people need extra ice for their medicines? What if other people need, I don't know, colostomy bags or something like that cleaned at more regular intervals? So the amount of water that maybe the three of us might need in a day to survive, to drink, is not enough to cover those that have other needs. And it's not even just disabilities or things that that cause extra needs in that way, but you're also thinking about just different groups and how they use water. So I think that a society's how a society prepares needs to account for possible vulnerabilities of their population. And a lot of times they do. And then other times we see certain people fall through the cracks because we didn't think, well, what else could there possibly be? And in the preparedness phase, it's actually our job, it's our responsibility, it's our duty, ethically speaking, to think, how are we addressing the needs of each individual, not each individual as a member of society? But that speaks to a larger issue about, well, can we actually help each individual during a disaster, or should we look at a more population level? And I think that answer changes based on the circumstances as well.
My question is, should it change?
I think it does, but it's not based on one thing being ethical or one thing being unethical, but I think that the circumstances alter cases, right? So I like thinking about quarantines and our lockdowns over COVID and stuff like that. For the population, quarantines and lockdowns were ethically correct. Now, we can make that, we look at it from a population ethics perspective, those were ethically correct. However, we also need to consider what those lockdowns and quarantines are going to do for certain individuals or certain groups of individuals. And I think that with proper preparedness, we do have the space to start unpacking that a bit. And I think what ends up happening is we don't do proper preparedness. We don't, well, you know, like that's a 10-year issue. Well, it might be, or it might happen again next year. So what are we doing to think about this? One of the other things that I work on when I talk to people about their profession's disaster ethics, and this goes to the population versus the individual, but it also goes to, do you take a deontological approach, which is like duty, or do you take a consequentialist, which is greatest good for the greatest number? I'm doing very shorthand on these. I don't care, and I am not going to judge the profession on which ethical theory or with which ethical framework they're using. I am not going to judge them. But a lot of times I don't think that they know that they are actually following a framework. And then when they go to talk to other professions or when they go to prepare, I worry that there's a butting of heads because, no, what we're doing is ethical. No, what we're doing is ethical. And there's this miscommunication because people don't understand that they're both ethical. I don't care, but now figure out a way to make it practical. And so that you're still fulfilling your ethical priorities and the other profession can fulfill their ethical priorities, but you learn the same language. And I think that's what a lot of what the teaching and outreach work I do is, I'm not judging you. I'm not going to say that you're unethical, but I need you to know what you're actually doing so that you can speak the right language to talk to other people and make the most ethical outcomes as a result.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely going to come back to COVID-19 a little later because I think that is a huge ethical area. So it becomes the question, you know, who bears the responsibility in disaster? Is it the state? Is it an individual? Is it the international community? Who actually should bear the most responsibility in these cases?
Responsibility for what? Right? Yeah. Okay. I got a nod for our listeners. I got a nod and a smirk. So I think that if we look at large scale disasters that affect a population, the state, the nation state is ultimately responsible for preparing, responding, recovering, and any kind of mitigation issues. The reason that they're responsible has to do with their sovereign authority, that it's about this, what is it called? I can't remember what it's called today. It was in my PhD a while ago, but it's about the this nation state's authority, right? And we say that they have legitimate authority to govern over that place, and with that, they then have certain responsibilities and duties. Now, a state usually thinks, if you go to like a realist perspective of international relations, you're going to see, well, you know, that the state has ultimate authority. They're the ones that have to make all the choices. They're the ones that get to declare war. I don't think ultimate authority is helpful anymore. I don't think that states do have ultimate authority. I think that the international community does have authority, whether or not it's ultimate. They do have authority over certain things in our day-to-day lives, in our politics, and in our governance. And so the international community has those responsibilities and has those duties and that authority, also because they're the ones that have the capacity. So you'll hear in ethics, ought implies can. So you should do something. You should be doing your duty, your responsibility, but you can only do your responsibility if you can do that responsibility, if you have the capacity. So I can't save all of the starving children in a country in another continent. That's not like I physically cannot do that. And therefore, I do not have the ethical responsibility to fulfill that. But if you are in a position where you can do it, then you should do it. And that's why we can raise certain responsibilities up to the international community. With disasters, my argument in my book, in my first book, Ethics, Law, and Natural Hazards, there you go. That's my plug. My argument is that the international community says that it's up to a state to respond to the needs of its citizenry, of its population, of the people in the country, whenever anything happens. And we all very much accept that. But my argument is that there are going to be certain times where a government, like a nation-state government, a national government, is either unwilling or unable to do that. So it's very possible that a national government gets wiped out. It's very, very possible, like by a tornado, by an earthquake, something like that. Well, who then has the responsibility? And we'd all go, oh, well, the international community should probably step in at that point. There is no legal mechanism. There is no conversation ethically around the world that it should actually be the international community that steps in, because we say, oh, well, sovereign authority, you have to be asked in. And you go, but there might be circumstances where you can't be asked in because there's nobody to ask the question, or there's circumstances where the national government is actively working against the population. We know that there are countries where, the government hates a certain group of the population and will therefore avoid giving them assistance. So my argument is that in those circumstances, the international community does have the responsibility to do something. It's not a legal responsibility. Oh, we'll hopefully get there one day. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, but we will get there one day. But ethically, there is a justification for doing something, for acting on behalf of humans, whether or not they're your citizens or not. They're still humans, and we still owe them some sort of responsibility. So the international community, I would argue, has that kind of responsibility, but also for setting benchmarks, for giving preparedness support. There's a new disaster law movement, and so the Red Cross will hopefully have guiding principles for international disaster law. So it's just a framework. Again, it's going to be non-binding by 2027, but there currently isn't an international disaster law. And so the international community has all these duties, ethical duties and responsibilities, but the frameworks and the mechanisms and the structures don't yet exist. National governments have the responsibility, for lack of a better word, social contract, but also if they want to have sovereign authority, then that's what they owe their citizens. But then we go into the individual, and I think the individual does have a bit of responsibility. One, to understand what's going on and what the government is trying to do, is doing, isn't doing. So understanding the individual's role in society, because that plays into whether or not we've declared certain vulnerabilities. And again, I'm not talking about just disability or even gender or pregnancy or something like that. But there are certain vulnerabilities that if you're part of an immigrant community and you don't speak the language, well, there are going to be certain things that we need to make sure that my neighbor can understand the earthquake warning just as much as I can understand the earthquake warning. And so I think that there's this understanding of what we can do, we should do for those around us, the rights and duties we owe to other humans, but also then what other people kind of owe to us. So they recognize that we don't have a car, and so maybe it might be useful to make sure that we get access to food as well. I think human rights, the moral understanding of human rights is crucial here, and understanding that if I can make a claim to food, water, medical care, so can you. And so we kind of both owe each other respect of those rights.
Well, it's a small question first, the quick one. You mentioned a lot of international community. By the international community, it's like very different when you compare with sovereign authority, right? Which is like it's very clear if like there is some events that oh this is the sovereigns, which is with the area confirms that's the sovereignty, something like that. So by the international communities, it's the people in general, or there are specific authority or organization that should be crossing offers and taking care of those responsibilities, like you mentioned it, Red Cross or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's the international organizations more than I think it's international community as far as people, be just like I owe my neighbors certain things, but I physically can't help you, right? I can't call your local government and go, I don't think he understands the language that is like the communications are being put out in. That's something that I can't do. And so I don't really have the responsibility for that. When we look at that, I'm going to come back to that, what responsibility we do have as individuals. But then if you look at it from like an international organization's perspective, so we have the UN, we have the IFRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross, organizations like Doctors Without Borders, they all have very, very different mandates, but they are mandated to assist during disasters, during crises. And because we live in this society and we pay taxes, we adhere to laws, whatever, we do recognize their authority to act on our behalf. And then they have the can, right? The ought implies can. They have the can of all of this. So when I'm talking about it from an international organization's perspective. But you bring up a good point about the individual. And again, going back to Peter Singer, I don't normally cite Peter Singer very much, but I think he's really, really onto something. Peter Singer gives the very famous argument of helping faraway others, right? So if I gave 10 pounds to somebody that's homeless on the streets in Birmingham, England, that same 10 pounds would actually get 10 people off the streets in a more developing country. And so what I should be doing is giving the 10 pounds to people far away, because I'm maximizing the impact that my assistance can do. That's great. And I completely agree with that. I'm on board with that and maximizing our impacts. But I don't know if that's realistic for how individuals will donate. And I'd rather argue for people donating however they want to, as opposed to mandating how it should be going out, because we do have the international organizations to assist. There's this other thing that I teach my students, or I at least offer my students as a question, that if you have to donate, if you have to be the one that assists as an individual, does that suggest that your government has fallen apart? And I think that there's like a question mark around that. And I don't think it's absolutely true, but I don't think it's absolutely false either. And so when we talk about individuals and our duties and responsibilities, I think it gets very much into ought implies can, and maybe it's not our job to be helping the distant others, because it should be our governments. But if our governments don't, then maybe the responsibility comes on us. So I think that in an ideal world, I could give you a straight answer, but because the practicalities of things change, I'm trying to figure out the most ethical way of dealing with our world as it is.
Well, practicalities, like based on your explanations, then usually some governments or authorities look at these international organizations of the community in general could be another threat to their security when handling their own problems. How do you balance between the security of the sovereign nations and the needs of helping from the international community? Because there's some argument that using this mechanism they also can threaten the security, Sometimes that's a
Right. So are you talking about development aid, or are you talking about like helping after a landslide?
well, it could be both.
So I will not talk about development aid.
Okay, then
Yeah.
talk with.
So like it. So when you say that it's a political force and stuff like that, that's a very different kind of assistance that I'm not interested in talking about it under a disaster ethics, because it's also
So,
not a disaster or a crisis. It's like
so,
ongoing, constant. There's no trigger events and things like that. So if we say that we should help other countries during a certain disaster, so does it come with political mechanisms? Of course it comes with political baggage. Of course it does. During Hurricane Katrina, I think it was 141 countries donated aid to the United States, and it was the first time that international assistance had come at that like level, right? At that amount of assistance. The reason that it was coming was it was an opportunity to help the US. Maybe it was a very like, I just want to help. You've helped me all those years. I'd really like to help. Maybe it was, this is our chance to like get in there and prove to the US. Maybe it was also, oh, you need some help now, don't you? You know what I mean? Like, who knows what the reasoning behind that assistance actually was. It was gratefully received, but at the same time, I don't know if the US actually needed it all. And so the same thing with donations. The Sri Lanka Boxing Day tsunami, there were tons and tons of assistance, like millions of crates of assistance going to Sri Lanka. Some of it had to not go to the people of Sri Lanka, because if it did, it would overwhelm the rice market and then tank the economy of Sri Lanka. So does it come with political baggage? Absolutely, it comes with political baggage. Do national governments have to filter what they take and why they're taking it? Absolutely, they have to. I think that the ethical drivers of that, which is what we should discuss, I think the ethical drivers of that kind of thing need to be thought out in advance. So what is our position on accepting international assistance? Are there countries that we won't take it from? Why? What if they're the only country that has the thing that we actually need, right? So I think that preparedness will be the thing that helps us understand the ethical implications of different things. And I don't think that we can make decisions if we're not talking about preparedness plans for specific disasters or specific countries or things like that, because I think it really changes the dynamic.
Yes, I actually want to take a little step back to one of your previous answers. And
Yep.
you said about there is no like mandate for governments to step in, etc., into countries. What happens then? And I have a very specific case study in my mind here. What happens when a government, falls and there's a vacuum, which is a consequence of a long-term issue from a previous disaster
Yep.
that has already led to an unstable government? What happens then when you have political violence, you have literally rioting in the streets? Is it an ethical and moral responsibility for a bigger neighbor to step in to try and quell the issues, or should they stay out and try and just watch and let the country try and sort itself out?
It's a loaded question. There's many parts to that. Yeah. So when you say there's rioting and things like that, what's the event? Is it just political chaos? If so, that's not something that I'm going to address. That's very different from a disaster or a crisis. I mean, they're obviously linked, but that's not something that my work would ever touch on, right? Because that's a political situation, and I think that there has to be a much more complex understanding of a political situation than there does like, okay, but an earthquake happened, and so nobody's fault, there's no political pieces going on to this. So then, is it somebody's responsibility to do something when, again, let's just say a landslide, right? And the government, you're saying, isn't doing something or isn't able to do something? Which one are you saying?
Isn't able to do anything.
Isn't able, yeah. So let's say that it's just outside their capacity, right? Like they don't have the money for it. They have, with all the will in the world, they have tried their best. the way that the international community works is that they're supposed to ask for assistance. They make a plea to the UN, and then the UN like figures out how to assist. That should be the way that it works. And the reason that it should continue to work that way is because the local people know best. We shouldn't try to like enforce or force any of our ways of being onto a national government. Also, the people know what they need, and so it makes so much more sense to go, yeah, but I need this. How many times have you had a birthday, and if you don't make a list, you get the stupidest gifts imaginable, right? I mean, so if you make a list and say, actually, these are the things I need. And if we're trying to reduce waste, ethical. If we're trying to avoid the excess logistics of having to bring it in and supply it, store it and things like that. If we're trying to do all these ethical things, then make a list, because how many times have you received a birthday present that quickly goes into the bin? Right? So we're trying to avoid all of these things. Gifts are really nice, but it would make so much more sense ethically if they asked for the assistance that they actually need. Now, the other thing that you said was, well, should just a bigger country? Oh, that's a problem, right? There's this problem with the idea of bigger countries, and we would have to worry about like disaster colonialism. Are we using a disaster? Are we using a crisis as a mechanism to infiltrate and enforce our ways onto a country or a population, make people feel indebted, say, actually, you want our help, so we're going to bring it in this way, and you have to accept it. Now, even if it's offered and not forced in, there's still this worry that some developing countries will feel that they have to say yes to things. Think about it. If you're the non-dominant person in any kind of relationship, you feel a bit like, I have to say yes. I don't want them to think that I don't appreciate them. I don't want their assistance to stop later. And it creates and exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. And so we have to be really careful on how aid is going in. A lot of times it will be country to country, and sometimes that works brilliantly. So if you look at urban search and rescue and things like that, they have relationships with the international community, and if there is a need, like there's a building that has fallen down because of an earthquake, we've had tons of like really big earthquakes recently, the international community, the UN sends out a call to the appropriate size urban search and rescue team, and that team stands up and is going to that disaster under the auspices of the United Nations, because that's what they need. They've asked and said, we need urban search and rescue, and they go, we got it, we'll organize, we'll get it on there for you, we got this. But it comes after a request. And so there's a lot of things that happen where people don't know what to request, I think, or they make a request and it's just like, you might need more than that, so maybe we have knowledge that we can share with you, but ultimately it should come from the national government of the affected area.
Yeah, and the country that I was hinting at was Haiti.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could tell I was hinting at that because Haiti is in a political crisis that is almost basically developed since 2010, and it led to unstable governments.
But then you watch as more and more international aid goes in, and are we going in to help and then make people dependent, or are we going in to bolster local resilience, local capacity, things like that? Sometimes if there is no local capacity, you have to do the former, but the goal should be to bolster local capacity and kind of like transition out. But that goes into more, international humanitarian disaster response and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then you said disaster colonialism. I think the perfect example of a country who tried to, has refused this element was Morocco in 2023, where they refused aid from Algeria and France because of historical tensions, and they're concerned that this could be a form of disaster colonialism.
Yeah.
So how do concepts like justice or fairness apply in and during disaster response and recovery?
exactly as they apply during peacetime or regular times. Justice doesn't take a break. Fairness doesn't take a break. But again, the circumstances alter cases. So what is just it's like telling a judge that they always have to say this when X, Y, and Z happens. But we recognize that, well, is a little bit of self-defense. Well, there was an element of lack of capacity. Well, there was you know what I mean? So I think that justice and fairness should act exactly as it does in peacetime, but we should recognize that the circumstances will alter how that presents itself, how it plays out.
We hoped you enjoyed today's episode with Lauren. This is the first of a two-part episode. Next time, we're going to predominantly focus on ethics and COVID-19. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we hope to see you very much again soon on another episode of the IDRiM podcast.